Hello and welcome to our weekly Shiur of the Parsha with the commentary of the Alshich. This week's Shiur is dedicated and sponsored by Blima Miller. And Blima Miller has sponsored this for the memory of her Zaidi, her grandfather who passed away just this year. His name is Yirmiyahu Zelig Ben Meir, and also for her 20th birthday. So Blima, just allow me to personally wish you only happy and proud memories for your grandfather, and that the skuz that undoubtedly he passed on to you in your life, and the skuz of sponsoring this year for the aliyah of his neshama and shemaim should bring you every single bracha and every good thing that you look for and hope for yourself. If you would like to sponsor this year for a celebration, a commemoration, or any good Jewish reason, then please just let me know, as Blima did at YY@rabbiYY.com, YY@rabbiYY.com, and I will be more than happy to dedicate this year as per your instructions. This week's Parsha is the beginning of a whole new book, the third book of the Torah, the Yayikra, and we're going to look at the Alshich, not at the beginning, although the Alshich at the beginning is extraordinarily interesting. It's very Kabbalistic, and of course, as we know, who've been studying this together for many, many months, the Alshich was both a halachist, a philosopher, a Kabbalist. In fact, he was a cowboynik. He had everything at his fingertips. The beginning is Kabbalistic, and I'm going to leave that aside, not because I don't think it's interesting. I think it's tremendously interesting. It's just that the practical side, the musa side of the Alshich and this week's Parsha, I think the message that he says in a little bit later in the Parsha, in Perek Daled, is absolutely astonishing. Now, it's a little bit tricky, this one, in as much as always, it's always a good idea to pause the video here, grab hold of your Chumash. I always have my little art scroll. I think at this stage I should pause and just apologize to art scroll, because I always disagree with their translations, or rather the Alshich does, but that's not their fault. Their translations are fabulous. It's just that the Alshich has a different way of looking at things. But if you want to grab hold of your, I've still not worked out why Zoom has a strange mirror image thing going on here. If I scratch my right ear, it's appearing to my eyes out of left. If anybody can explain to me, anybody contacts or any relatives at Zoom, whether you're Hasidic or non-Hasidic, of course, Hasidim is Zim, not Zoom, then please let me know why it can't get it right. Okay, or perhaps why I can't get it right, but never mind. Yeah, if you would like to grab hold of your art scroll Chumash, pause the video at this point and come back. We can you'll be able to see what my problem is here, because the problem extends over quite a large area of Perek Daled. So let me just read to you what the Parsha says, and then we'll translate according to the art scroll, and then we'll look at 4 of the questions the Alshich asks. But I say, instead of being just in the first 2 psukim, he spans up to from 1 to 17, and we have to get the feel of that in order to understand what he wants us to learn from this week's Parsha. So if any of that made sense at all, let's start at the beginning of chapter Daled in the book of the Yayikra. And if you do have the art scroll, I think it's called the Stone Chumash. I can't remember what it's called. Yes, the Stone edition of the Chumash. Then it's on page 554, which makes it extraordinarily easy to get to. So I pause while you perhaps pause, and then we carry on. Okay, glasses off. And he says, the Pasuk says, "V'yidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor," and Hashem speaks to Moshe to say, "Daber b'nei Israel," speaks to the Jewish people, lemor, to say, "Nefesh ki tzechto b'shkoga," a person, literally a soul, that sins unintentionally. I'm just quickly looking to see how the outscroll does do this. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, speaks to the children of Israel, saying, so far so good. When a person will sin unintentionally, and then it says here in English, from among all the commandments of Hashem. Yes. Kisechta b'shkoga, back to the Hebrew, if he sins unintentionally, mikol mitzvahs Hashem, from all of the mitzvahs of Hashem. He says, from amongst the mitzvahs of Hashem. Okay, not terrible. Asher lo sa'aseno, which, let's see how they're doing it, that may not be done. That may not be done. Okay. Asher lo sa'aseno, it should not be done. Okay, they don't do mitzvahs. And he commits one of them. It says here, Asher lo taseno v'osem achas mehina, which he didn't do, and then v'osem achas mehina, and he did do one of them. It's a very hard translation. I must admit, when I was preparing this at first, before I looked at the Alshich, when he just pointed me to it, I didn't quite get the point he was trying to make, because I couldn't quite work out the translation, even with an English translation in front of me. The Hebrew is very difficult. That's why I want you to have this week the Chumash in front of you to see this. Anyway, obviously the Pasuk is talking about you've done an unintentional sin. For an unintentional sin in the book of Yayikra is all got to do with the korbanos, the sacrifices you bring to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, and of course its success of the Beis Hamikdash. If you did an unintentional sin, you accidentally did something wrong, then you've got to bring what's called a chatos. A chatos, the word chet, means an unintentional sin. So it's a sin that you'll bring. Now, the interesting thing is, obviously, it should then go on to talk about doing exactly that. But it doesn't. In actual fact, after that, it then goes on to talk about other things you have to do, or rather, somebody else has to do something. And that is, it goes on to talk about the Kohen. What if the Kohen gets something wrong? So it's very strange. It's almost like, ladies and gentlemen, we now pause for an interlude while we talk about something completely different. It should, having established that we're talking about an individual who does something wrong unintentionally, tell you what he's supposed to do. But that comes in Pasuk 17. Whoa! And in between then, we've got the statement of what happens if the Kohen Gadol, bringing a sacrifice for the Jewish people, he makes an unintentional mistake. And then it goes on to talk about the Nasi, the prince, who brings a sacrifice, what he does. And then it takes up, the interlude's over, and it goes back to talking about the individual when it comes to discussing this in Pasuk 17. So is it 17? Yes. So why, the question is, why does it take that? Sorry, not that's at 17:27, verse 27. So why, if an individual person wrong the people, the land shall sin unintentionally, and then he shall, and it tells you what he should do. So why is this interlude in between telling us about an individual sinning unintentionally? Then 27, well, 25, psukim later, it tells you what you should do. And we break off and start talking about what happens if the Kohen Gadol does something wrong. Interesting. Let me just read that about the Kohen Gadol to you, so that we're up to speed together. So, Pasuk Gimel, Im HaKohen Mashiach, if the anointed Kohen Yechto, if he sins unintentionally, La'ashos Ha'am, when he's bringing the sacrifice of the people, then he'll bring his sin, Asher Choto Par Ben Boker, and he brings a cow, Tomim Lashem Chatos, and then it goes on to all the details. That's what we're going to be examining now. 4 questions in the Alshich, and then some very, very interesting insights. Perhaps you would even say obvious insights, although not so obvious unless, as it were, you have the Alshich's glasses on to look at it, that derive from the Psukim. And obvious insights into human nature, and we'll see the language of the Alshich is going to embrace this human nature thing very, very passionately and dissect it shortly. That's what it's all about. Before I carry on with the Alshich, I think I have to introduce you to 2 concepts which are in the famous classic philosophical ethical work called the Chovos Levovos, and it's in the section called Shiur HaBitochen. As you probably know, I translated this. That's my translation of the Sefer. It has the grey, the grey bits are my commentary. There's a brand new translation. It's got notes at the bottom, and there's a large introduction to each chapter. But chapter 3 of Shiur HaBitochen, then the Rabbeinu Bachya, who is the author, he asks the enormous question, the question that challenges any woman or man of faith, and indeed Bitochen, which I translate in my book, following the lead of Rav Matisyahu Solomon, Shlita, my old Rebbe. He says that it's essential to know that Bitochen means certainty, to be vadoi. Okay, to be certain. It's a very high spiritual level. To become a Baal B'tochen is maybe a lifetime's work, but you might be stopped getting there with the classic question that challenges anybody of faith, which is, why do bad things happen to good people and why do good things happen to bad people? The classic Tzaddik Varaloi, Rosh Hashanah of well, certainly of Judaism, but probably anybody Jewish or not Jewish who believes in Hashem will struggle with this one. It's the classic question. And when he talks about this, he's got an approach which we'll see fits very nicely with what we're talking about in our Parsha through the eyes of the Alshich. And he says the first thing when a person struggles with this, perhaps you're sitting in a plane next to somebody who's not religious, who challenges you with that classic question, your first response to that person, and indeed to yourself, says the Chovos Levavos, Rabbeinu Bachya, is you're not the first person to have asked that question. You're not the first person to have thought about this question. And here in chapter 3, he lists many, many psukim from Habakkuk and David Melech and others, great prophets, who struggled with this one, who saw the what seems unjust and the injustice of it, and it troubled them greatly, including David Melech, who says that I struggled my whole life to become a good person, and the bad guys prosper and I suffer. And even though he says there's no one answer to fit all cases because all cases are different, I still feel it's such an important question, such a troubling question, that I'm going to give you some insights. Now, even though he says I'm going to give you some insights, you'll find some of the best insights to this question of all in chapter 3 of Shiur B'tochen and Chovos Levavos. So warmly recommended, whether you get mine with the commentary or not. However, let me read to you. So on page 150, he says the following thing. Despite this, I feel it's appropriate to elaborate. I'll just read my translation, because what's the point of reading the Hebrew and translating it in English, which I've already done. Despite this, I feel it appropriate to elaborate on this question, that's why do bad things happen to good people, to lessen the frustration and real pain that the question causes. One of the many reasons that a tzaddik may have to struggle and exert himself to secure a livelihood, we're talking about just feeding your kids, is it may be a consequence of a sin he committed in the past. This is what Mishli refers to. Certainly, tzaddik in this world will suffer for his misdeeds, and much more so an evil man. In my commentary at the bottom, I quote the famous pasuk in Koheles, in tzaddik ba'oretz, there's no such thing as a tzaddik in the world. She has a toiv who does good, but below yechta doesn't slip up at some point. So it could be that when you see a tzaddik suffering, and you go, oh, that's not so unfair, he's such a tzaddik. Yes, but he made a mistake. He made a mistake in the past. And if I turn a few pages to page 155, he says, I think it's 155, I've got my note here in front of me, sorry, 154, do apologize. He says, another reason is that tzaddik may not feel outraged enough at the behavior of his generation. So he's done nothing, indeed he's done nothing wrong, but he didn't feel outraged is the language here, and certainly protested enough the behavior of the people of his generation, and protest sufficiently on Hashem's behalf. And the Shiur B'tochen goes on to cite examples from Tanakh that show that such a phenomenon does exist. So I want you to keep those two ideas in your mind, because we're going to return to them when we look at the Alshich. So there are many more reasons he supplies why bad things could happen to good people, or a tzaddik even. However, having said that, there's no such thing as Shlomo Melech, whom we believe is the wisest man who ever lived. No such thing as a human being who doesn't slip up sometime. And secondly, it could be that the tzaddik, if he's not slipped up and done something personally wrong, he did not protest enough, effectively enough, or not enough at all, about the behavior of people of his generation. So keep that thought in mind, because we will be visiting that when we look at the Alshich. So let me read to the Alshich's 4 questions, and you really will need to have the Chumash in front of you, but I will read the Chumash as we go along, so it should make it a little bit easier to follow, in which case we're going back to chapter 4, and we're at verse 1. So here's what it says. V'yidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor. And Hashem speaks to Moshe to say what? All the following halachos. In that case, if lemor says to speak to the Jewish people and tell them what he's got to say, why does it repeat the word lemor straight after that? Daber b'nei Yisrael lemor. speak to the Jewish people to say. He just told us, Moshe, to say, and now he's got to tell him to say again. So the Alshich says, question 1, Al Omer Lemor Pam Shenis. Why does it say Lemor twice? When it says in Pasuk 1, and then Pasuk 2, Dabar Ben Israel, speak to the Jewish people to say. Who's doing the saying here? Why two sayings? What's that about? So question number 1, we'll come back to that shortly. Base, question 2, this bit of the Pasuk that I was struggling to translate in Pasuk base, he says that we don't need those words at all. And when the Alshich says you don't need the words, and of course that's an alarm bell ringing, that's a red light flashing, because Hashem, as we know, is good at Hebrew, he doesn't make any mistakes. And therefore, if the words that we don't need to have in the Pasuk to understand the Pasuk are there, it must be telling you something else, which is not part of the Pasuk, or at least not apparently part of the Pasuk. So let me read to you again to point out where I was struggling. This is Dalid and Pasuk base. Dabra Yisrael lemor, speak to the Jewish people to say, Nefesh kisechta, soul that it sins, Bishkoga unintentionally, Mikol mitzvahs Hashem, from all the mitzvahs Hashem, Asher lo asasena, but also me'achas meheno, and you did from one of them. Just say, says the Alshich, and a soul that sinned Bishkoga, Mikol mitzvahs Hashem, from all the mitzvahs of Hashem. Full stop, done, end the pasuk. What's these extra 5 words? Hashem doesn't make mistakes and miss this out. And that he didn't do, and but also me'achas mehino, and did from one of them. And it sounds gibberish anyway. That he didn't do, and then from one that he did. You're struggling to translate. Good. Then there's Pasuk Gimel, which goes into that Pasuk more length, this strange wording, which I'm not going to trouble you with. But let's look at Pasuk question 4. The question I asked you before. After it goes on to talk about the sin of the individual who unintentionally makes a mistake, which requires him to bring a chatos, and then breaks off as an interlude, and it goes on to talk to us about the Kohen, the anointed Kohen, who is bringing a sacrifice to the Jewish people, and he makes a mistake. What's going on there? Those are our questions, which we're going to analyze this week, and it's going to take us, even though it sounds a little bit religious, if I dare say the word, sometimes grammatical, we're going to see that Alshich is going to take us into basic human nature. Basic human nature. I suppose if I was going to pause here and tell you that this Shiur, this Alshich, piece of Alshich, if we abstract it from his commentary on the Chumash and just make it a Shiur in its own right, and I was giving a title to the Shiur, I would give the title The Blame Game. The Blame Game. And I think we all know what that phrase in English means, where you blame everybody and everything else for things that you've done wrong. It's basic human nature. We're extraordinarily resistant to accepting that perhaps we are responsible for the outcomes of our actions, our words, our deeds, our writings. And we're always very, very keen to find a substitute who will take the blame. Incidentally, as I say substitute, don't think, I don't think I need to say this to you, but don't think that the offering of a sacrifice, you just take an animal and you cut its throat, and then you, depending on what sort of sacrifice it is, you eat part of it, but that makes your sin go away. That's absolute nonsense. In fact, as the Hashem says many times, I don't want your sacrifices. But you asked for them in Yayikra. No, I want you back. The sacrifice is a vehicle to bring you back, but just killing an animal, that's not going to do anything unless you allow it to become a vehicle to, as it were, transpose yourself into the animal and imagine that you deserve to die for the thing that you've done wrong. That's the concept of offering a sacrifice. But Hashem prefers the sacrifice, as it were, the person brings. After all, korban comes from the word korov, to draw near. Those people used to be involved in the heyday of the Baal Tshuva movement. Of course, it was called kiruv rechokin. Kiruv, there's the word kiruv, korban again, to draw close. Hashem wants you close. He's not really interested in the animals. However, having said all that, let me read to you what the Alshich has to say here. I think you'll enjoy this enormously. And I say it's a very, very important insight into you or me or us, human beings. The purpose here of Hashem in writing these psukim in the way that he does is to diagnose and reveal and then write a prescription to cure the human condition that so often reverts to the blame game. And that's not quite a literal translation of those words, but you get the idea. So that a person should never turn around and say to themselves, if I did do an avera unintentionally, are you hearing that, heaven? Unintentionally, not my fault. Baruch Hashem, then Baruch Hashem, that's all I did was something unintentional. I'll be okie dokie. It was not intentional. It was not by design that I came to do this terrible thing, or this, whatever the thing is. And I'm not going to get upset and depressed about that. Because of the unintentional sin that my hand slipped and caused this mistake. I didn't know. Listen to the language here, because this is amazing. I'm a human being, I'm not God. Hashem, he doesn't make mistakes. Only Hashem could never forget something. I forgot. I slipped up. I'm only a human being. Only human. And it's the same with every human being. That's what people say when they slip up. It's the blame game. I blame everything. It's the human condition. At this stage, you're blaming the human condition, not me. We do that, says the Alshich, as a defense mechanism in order to lessen our feelings of guilt and responsibility for what we did. But didn't we do something unintentionally? Isn't that what we're talking about here? Intentional and unintentional, the Alshich is just about to explain, is not as clear-cut a division in the Torah's eyes as it is in our eyes, and certainly in my eyes when I do something wrong. And indeed, if you don't address this flawed logic, it can soon spread like a toxin all the way through all of your performance of all kinds of mitzvahs. It was my fault, because I was brought up, my parents didn't send me to yeshiva, or whatever the excuse is going to be. Bo Elokim, so the Rebbe Shem comes along and says, Dabaro b'nei Yisrael, so now back to the Pasuk. Dabaro b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people. And what you've got to say, Lemor. This is the second Lemor. This is our first question. Let me just remind you, of course you've got your commentary, you can look yourself. Pasuk 1, V'dabar Hashem al Moshe Lemor. God speaks to Moshe to say. But then it says, Dabaro b'nei Yisrael Lemor. Speak to the Jewish people to say. And our question was, why two says? And the two says, TWO says. And the answer is, and this is astonishingly brilliant. He says this, the Torah is telling that Hashem saying, I know your nature. I know human nature. After all, I designed it. Of course, your immediate response is going to be, it's not my fault. It was an accident. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't my heart intended this. Okay, and therefore, the Pasuk says, Hashem says to Moshe to say to them, and that's the first lemor, lemor, kolemer daber b'nei Yisrael, ki ma sheroy lehem lemor, the second lemor. What's the second lemor? It's for them to say, daber b'nei Yisrael, lemor, let them say, nefesh ki techta b'shkoga. This should be a motto. This should be a slogan that every Jew should have it imprinted in his or her mind. If my soul sinned unintentionally, and my sin, my soul sinned unintentionally because of something I did previously intentionally. And now if we go back to the Pasuk and read it again, it makes sense. Pasuk base. Dabaru b'nei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, lemor, to say, that they should say, it should be a motto. Nefesh ketzechta, a soul who sins b'shkoga accidentally, they call mitzvahs Hashem, from all the mitzvahs Hashem, asher lo sase, but also me'achas mehino. They didn't do it, or they did do something wrong, me'achas mehino. They came unintentionally to do something wrong from one of the mitzvahs that they did intentionally wrong. It affects. We're all human beings. We all slip up. And how many times? I mean, I can easily think in my own life and observing other people too, that somebody who doesn't take something very, very seriously. I mean, I'm involved in education, so that would be a good example. Guess what? If you don't put in the effort to prepare the work when it comes to the exam, when you're tested, you might simply not have the resources to actually succeed. And there's, every excuse in the world. No, it's just because you didn't get it right at the beginning. So that's what he says the second lemor is. If they should say, this should be a slogan, this should be a well-known statement or saying amongst the Jewish people. If I messed up unintentionally, it's because there was a certain lackadaisicalness, a certain too relaxed attitude when I did something wrong intentionally, which is spread indeed to move forward in time. That will mean that I will unintentionally come to do something wrong again. Let me read a little bit more to you. So therefore, what the Jewish people should say is, this should be their motto. A person makes a mistake accidentally, because he previously did something, or she previously did something intentionally. And that's created a certain laxness in their subconscious approach to Judaism. And the answer, and anyway, as we know, the Chazal tell us that maybe to call it's a Gemara. The Rabbanu Shalom does not allow even the animal, the cattle of tzaddikim, to accidentally graze in sun. The Alshich used this example many times because this principle he holds very strongly. It doesn't allow a tzaddik's animals to graze in somebody else's land, maybe stick his head through a fence and eat somebody else's grass. It protects a tzaddik from accidental sinning. So why would he not present a tzaddik from accidental sinning? As we saw in the Chovos Levavos, in my translation of first later at the beginning of the Shiur, because it might be that a tzaddik did something wrong before. And that allows an unintentional sin to occur, because Hashem has taken away his protection to stop that unintentional sin from occurring, as a pointer to the fact that in the past you did something and that has to be dealt with. So therefore he says, if Hashem protects the animals of tzaddikim from not doing something wrong unintentionally, how much more so tzaddikim themselves? It says in Shmuel Aleph Beis and Tes, Ragli Chasidav Yishmar, another pasuk, there's the feet, the path, the steps of the tzaddikim are protected by Hashem. Rabbi Meir says in Obas, involved Mishnah Aleph, if you learn Torah, if you do the mitzvah properly, Hashem will protect you from any sin. And that's what you have to say. That's what they have to have in mind. The sin, that's the soul which is sinned b'shkoga accidentally, you've got to say to yourself, how did that happen? Now, this is the Gemara. Remember the Gemara in Brachos and Daf Hey? If something goes wrong in a person's life, you've got to be fashvish from myself. You've got to engage in analysis, self-analysis to see, and here spiritual self-analysis, is there anything that I could have done wrong that could have led to this? And the nice thing is that Hashem always punishes Mida Keneged Mida, so there will undoubtedly be a connector to allow you to see what it is that you intentionally did in the past that could lead you to this now subconscious reenactment when you do something not intentionally. But there's a connection. There's a connection. It comes from one mitzvah in the past that you did do intentionally wrong. And that flaw has not been corrected. So Hashem withdraws his protection to allow you to slip up now in order to invite you to engage in a process of introspection to correct what you did wrong. It's a chesed. As David Melech says, couldn't remember the positive. And so you, Hashem, is chesed. Could you pay a person back for his or her deeds? That's mida keneged mida. What happened? What you did wrong, the same thing happens to you. As a method, as a technique, in fact, the only technique for you to know that you did something wrong in the first place and address that. And the culmination of the addressing process is when you bring a korban, from the word korv. You've now reconnected with God, not for what you did accidentally, ultimately for what you did intentionally 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. As he said, it could be that tzaddik suffers for something he did in the past. Because as the posuk says, it was one of the things that you did in the past. Let's look at that posuk again. Now the posuk that's struggling with the translation comes back to life. Again, posuk Dalet, as a pair Dalet, and posuk Aleph, a posuk base. Dabra b'nei Yisrael lemor, speak to the Jewish people, for them to say, if it's the case, a soul sins unintentionally, mikol mitzvahs Hashem, from all the mitzvahs Hashem, asher lo saseh never also that you've done, both positive and negative, it's one of them. In the past, he done intentionally. That's led to this. Now, deal with that, work on that, change that. Now, that's very important. And now it sounds perfect. It's a perfect insight into human psychology. Hashem knows this. This is what you'll do. I'll protect you from that. Engage in introspection. The accidental thing you did is to point the finger and or the sign to post towards what you did do wrong. Then you can put it right. And when you put it right, then we come together, you bring a korban. Ta-da! Except for the human condition. The human condition is always to reject blame and accept guilt, and always look for a scapegoat, if I can use that phrase. And that answers our other question. Why do we have an interlude? Instead of going on to say, okay, this is how you do this, you individual who've done something wrong. This is the procedure you engage in to repair your accidental sin and lead back to your intentional sin and reconnect to God. That comes posuk 27. So therefore, it's 25 psukim later. And it breaks off of the interlude. It talks about the Kohen Gadol, or the Kohen, who offers the sacrifice for you. When he's done something accidentally wrong, when he's bringing a sacrifice to the Jewish people, why does it break off? Back to the human condition. So let me read to you the Alshich on this. So before it tells you what you've got to do in order, individual, to apologize and to correct the accidental mistake, read previous intentional mistake that you did wrong. And it says, no. Now let's talk about the Kohen who slips up and accidentally makes a mistake bringing the korban. Then he has to bring a bull for a sacrifice, etc. Why? There's a reason for that interlude and for that interjection of the story of the Kohen and what he has to do. There's a connection between the sin of individuals and the unintentional sin of the Kohen who didn't bring the sacrifice properly, requiring him to bring a korban. The connection is as follows. We've already established the principle that you and I, as individuals, when we do something wrong accidentally, the truth is it's the child of something that was intentional in the past. That caused that unintentional sin. Hashem says, I also want to warn you and let you know. But there is something else that could have caused you to have done something wrong. And that other thing that could have caused you to do something wrong now accidentally does not directly connect to you. It connects to somebody else. The Kohen. The Kohen. What does that mean? As the Kohen Mashiach. That means to say the story we start off with, the story about the person who brings the carbon for the accidental sin, which really goes back to his intentional sin. The truth is that that itself, that whole process from unintentional to intentional, was caused by the Kohen. Caused by the Kohen? Yes, as emphasized and is clarified by the fact that he now makes an unintentional mistake. That all fits together beautifully. How? So he says, the Kohen brings the sin for the people for the mistake that the people have made. Okay. Because he did not do what the Pasuk requires a Kohen to do. This is a Pasuk in Malachi base. Ki sifsi Kohen yishmer das, v'tari yavaksha bepihu. It's the role of a Kohen that they will guard the Torah of Hashem. They are the priests, after all, to guard the Torah of Hashem. Yavaksha bepihu. And you should, and it should be a two-way thing. You should seek guidance from the Kohanim, the leaders of the Jewish people, and they should instruct the Jewish people. That they should correct the behavior of the Jewish people when they are going astray and going wrong. And had they done that, then there would be no slip-up, accidental mistake when they're offering a sacrifice on behalf of the people. No, that requires them to bring their own sacrifice. It's an indication that they did something wrong. What did they do wrong? It's the job of a Kohen to lead the Jewish people. They should have protested when the Jewish people were going wrong, when we were going wrong. Individual sins, incidentally, intentional individual sins are very often take place because a person doesn't think it's too important, because the zeitgeist, because the avirah, it's in the air, it's in the time, that is not such a big deal. And that leads individuals to do something wrong. Along comes the Kohen and says, no, this matters. This matters greatly. But because the Kohen did not warn the generation that you're slipping up, you're becoming weak in this part. This is worse than the individual sin that he did. Because the sin of the entire people now becomes his responsibility. As Hashem said to Yecheskel, you didn't tell the Jewish people off. The sinner will die for his sin, but I'll seek his blood, his almost revenge on you, because you should have done something to help him. The Chofetz Chaim cites a story that he saw with his own eyes of a Jew who was in some sort of business which he was breaking law, not paying taxes or whatever he was doing wrong, and he was put in trial. It was in the city of Rakov. And he was being taken after the trial to go to Siberia, which, of course, in those days, 10 of them could be a death by freezing anyway, unlikely to come back. And he asked the guards, could he speak to the rabbi, because they were passing the rabbi's house on the way to the train station. And the guards had pity on him and took him to the house of the rabbi, and the rabbi opened the door and he said, Rabbi, you know I'm going to Siberia now. The guards have kindly let me speak to you. I just want to let you know it's entirely your fault. You saw me growing up. You saw I was a wild one. You saw I wasn't paying attention to the rules. You never once tried to intervene. You didn't protest my behavior. So now I leave my wife and children behind and I go to Siberia, but I want you to know it's your fault. It's a true story that the Chofetz Chaim said, and he says this in the context of the responsibility of people who could intervene and don't intervene. Because he didn't. Again, let's read that again. Because you did not tell off or try and straighten the behavior of the generation who the people who did the things wrong, they're going to suffer and die. But their death, I will lay at your door. It's your responsibility, as that Jew on his way to Siberia said to the Rav of Rakov. And that's why it says, if the Kohen who was anointed Yechto accidentally sins, yeah, that incidental sin that you did in the offering of the sacrifice comes about because you didn't intentionally intervene when they are offering their behavior, when they were altering their behavior and behaving badly. Now, the next bit of the Alshich is absolute genius. Let's consider what we said and put it all together again. We said, why is it that it talks about the individual sin as being unintentional? It's to point to the intentional sin. Then we asked, why is there an interlude and it breaks off to talk about the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen, who has made a mistake in bringing sacrifice? It's to point at his lack of intervention before that has led them to make mistakes, having to bring this in the first place. He's complicit, he's part of that. But our first question was, why not put the continuation of the story of the individual's sin and the sacrifice that's required to put it right all together? Why is this interlude? And here the Alshich says something brilliant. And once again, we return to the story of the human nature thing, the blame game. Because if it is the case that he was to start and tell the story of the individual sin, and then go and tell the story. In fact, if you think about it, it could start with the Kohen, his sin, and then it could start of the story of the Nasi, which comes next, and then the individual. Then it's obvious that it's going to be a nice blame game available for the individual. Hold on a minute. That Kohen, you know what? The Kohen, it's all his fault. Just like Rubenstein was saying over from the Alshich. If only he'd intervened, I would never have come to be lax intentionally in a mitzvah, which would have led to me doing something wrong. It's all his fault. And Hashem says here, if I can see this, it's not my fault, it's the Mashiach, the anointed Kohen. He didn't stop my behavior. It's all his fault. And then you let yourself off the hook. So also, in order not to let yourself off the hook, the Torah starts by talking about you and your sin. And then it tells you that there is a connection to the Kohen. Yes, indeed. But that doesn't let you off the hook. But if it starts with just the Kohen, then you say, oh, it's all his fault. It doesn't. It's not all his fault. He's complicit. He is playing an important part of it. He didn't play his role, but ultimately nor did you. His mistake does not mean to say that you are not mistaken or haven't made mistakes or haven't chosen to make mistakes. So says the Alshich. Rather brilliant insight, I think, from the Alshich in this as well. Just one last thing. Way back in Bereshis, in Lech Lecha, the Alshich points to a Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara in Shabbos is on page Nun Hey Amud Aleph, and it says an incredibly interesting thing. Listen to this Gemara here. Hashem says, it's based on the Parsha, V'gam Hashem Elov, and Hashem said to him, the him isn't stated at this moment who it is. Abor b'tzarech ha'ir b'tzarech Yerushalayim. Pass through the city, through Jerusalem. This is at the beginning of the siege of the Babylonians, which will lead to the destruction of the city, the total exile of the Jewish people, and the destruction of the temple. Go, he said, and write on the foreheads of all the Jews who groaned and cried out in pain about all the terrible things that were going on in Jerusalem. So he's saying to somebody, go and write the letter Tov, the final letter of the alphabet, on the foreheads of the people who were distressed and complained and cried about the behavior of the Jewish people. The Gemara says that the person that he asked to do this was the Malach Gabriel. So it was not a human being. Seems strange somebody comes up and says, excuse me while I just write a Hebrew letter on your forehead. What he said to the Malach Gabriel was, write in ink the letter Tov and the heads of those who were upset and distressed and cried about the behavior of the generation. And this must be heavenly ink, invisible ink, you wouldn't see it. So that when the destruction occurs, the angels, perhaps through the forms of the Babylonian soldiers, will not kill them. But Amatzan shall Rishayim, and on the foreheads of the bad guys, the people who did all the terrible stuff, Tov Shadam, write a letter Tov, the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet, only in blood, invisible blood. So they'll be killed for what they justly deserve for their behavior. Ombra Midas of Din, the Midas of Din, the aspect of judgment, says the Fnei Kodesh Baruch says to Hashem Rabban Shalom, Almighty Man, what's the difference between the two groups? Omer Law, Halal Tzadikim Gemurim, Halal Rishon Gemurim. These are Tzadikim Gemurim, and these are complete saints, and these are Rishon Gemurim, these are completely evil people. Omer Lafan Rabban Shalom, Almighty, Hoy Biyodam Nimchais. But the good people should have protested. Oh, they were upset and they cried, but they should have protested. And they didn't protest the behavior of the bad people. And Hashem says to the Midas Adin, it was obvious to me, had they protested, nobody would have listened. The Midas Adin says, if that was obvious to you, and you knew that, that's okay. But it wasn't obvious to them, and they didn't know that. They couldn't know that. You know everything. But they couldn't have known that. And this, as the Gemara, is the only time when Hashem wanted to do something and it did not work. It didn't work out, which makes no sense because nothing Hashem wants to know, want to do can never happen. And secondly, he would know what the argument of the Midas Adin was anyway. So why is he even bothering arguing with them if he knows that is correct, and ultimately they will also be killed when the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. For here we have to turn to the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai says something extraordinarily brilliant. It's never the case that the behavior of a tzaddik is, indeed they didn't protest enough, exactly as we're saying here. And this principle, therefore, was not new. This, as we've seen, is in the center of Yayikra. You can learn this and understand this from the analysis of the Pesukim that we just did. You should always protest the behavior of somebody who's behaving badly, as the Rabbi of Rakov was told. In fact, the Chofetz Chaim goes on in one of the smaller stories to say that if you have the ability to get people to listen to you, not in your own town because they saw you growing up and they remember you as a little kid, with the short trousers, the short pants, kicked a football through somebody's window, and they can't take you seriously as a rabbi. But in the adjoining town, or maybe in the next city or the next country, they've all listened to you, then you've got an obligation to go there and try to get people to listen to you. You always have a responsibility to try to get people to change. At the destruction of the first temple, the Tzaddikim failed in that responsibility. But Hashem knew that, so what's this whole dialogue between him and the Midas Adin telling us? The ultimate truth was a tzaddik and a tzaddik's behavior, even if he slipped up, is never ignored. And indeed, apparently, says the Kabbalistic books, when the destruction of Jerusalem occurred and it was destroyed, the tzaddikim didn't die in pain, didn't die in agony, whereas the Rishaim did. There's always a distinction between the behavior of a good person and a bad person. It's always taken into account. But ultimately, a good person is still held to account if he or she could have intervened to change the behavior of others, if they could. And if they ignored that ability and ignored that opportunity, then indeed, it might be that Hashem will have to indicate that to them by the fact that something goes wrong in their own life, which leads them, once more, as we said before, to analyze, is there anything I did intentionally that could have led to this? Very interesting. I wish you all a good Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.